So now we have our front and back torso drapes off the form. And we're going to clean these up on the muslin so there is less work when we get to the actual paper. So the first thing we want to do is start straightening out all the straight lines. And I'm going to start with the front and then we'll move into the back. So this is our front drape. And the first thing I want to do is straighten out my shoulder. Now I'm going to use a marker for this video, but I suggest at home use something that is a very accurate line, and possibly a sharpened pencil would be better. But so you can see it in the video, I'm going to use a marker. Now we corrected this line and we made little red marks here so that the line is actually here instead of where our dash line is. So I'm going to use that as my correct line. And then the next thing I want to do is I want to square off so that my front neck is at a right angle here. I don't want this to come to a V. Many times on the form, your neck is actually kind of V-shaped where they've sewn it, but that's not really correct. So what I'm going to do is just open this neck up about 3/16 at the base and square it off here. Then I'll take my berry curve. You can also use a French curve. And I'm just going to connect the dots here and land on my squared off line that I just made. So I'm going to come around through here so that I have a nice pretty line for my neckline. Now the next thing I want to do is my armhole. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to try to connect all the lines. Now if you have a dash in your line that's kind of irregular or out of sync with the rest of them, line up the majority of them. Don't try to come along and line up each and every dot, because sometimes some of them might be out of whack a little bit. Now, you'll need to turn your curve around, whether you're using a French curve or a berry curve, to get the compatible line. But once you get the shape you like, then that'll be the one you keep. Like I said before, sometimes it's easier to use a pencil than it is to use a marker to do this with, but I'm using the marker so you can see what we're doing. Now, let's go back to this dart right here. We want to draw in this dart. This is going to be our dart point where we put the dash line in. That's the end of our dart. So I'm going to draw one dart leg in here, trying to line up the edge of my little dash lines I made when I was draping. Now these may be curved a little bit. The most important one is the end ones at the end of the dart and the beginning of the dart. So if the rest of them are kind of out of whack, just make sure your line is straight from that point on. And I'm going to do the same here, and I'm going to bring this dart to right here. But that's my dart. Now I want to measure the lower dart leg, and it's 5 inches. So on this dart leg, I want to put a line at 5 inches so that I have them the same length. So right here would be the end of my upper dart leg. In between those two marks, I want to find center. So it's 2.5. Just a little bit less than 2.5, so I'm going to put a dot at 1 1/4. That's going to be my fold line, okay? But that's not the fold line I want. See where my apex is? Let's just put a dot there. If I drove this fold line completely out, my dart is about 1/2 inch too high for my apex. So I want to shift this fold line starting at 5 inches, which is the dart length. I'm going to come down and mark 5 inches on this as well. So 5, 5, 5, and 5. And I want to take that 5-inch mark and I want to direct the fold line back to the apex. Now this time I'm going to try to use this pencil so you can see it, because there is a difference here. So I'm going to draw in, the red line represents my corrected dart. Now I'm going to go from this point and find 5 inches on that fold line. And then I'm going to do the same up here. I'm just going to draw this in. Now this dart sometimes comes out slightly longer, this dart leg. But see, now I've repositioned this dart, leaving it at the correct place in the side seam, but I've repositioned it so that it will head toward the apex. So that's how I want to keep the dart. Now once you have this, we're going to fold this dart in, and I'm going to show you how to continue on with your side seam. So now, this is the new dart. This is the old dart, the black one. So we're going to take the red dart and we're just going to fold it on the lower dart leg. And I just kind of crease it with my fingers. And then I'm going to put it together with the upper dart leg, the red one, and ignoring what's going on with the black one, because that was the original dart. The red one is our new one. That's why it's so handy to have multiple colored pencils or pens, markers in your toolkit when you're doing patterns. Because when you have to remark something, it's always good to be able to make a different color line so you can delineate it from the original and the one you've changed. See, now I've got this new dart folded in here, and it's directed at the apex. Now I want to clean up the side seam. So I'm going to turn it back around, and right here on the side seam, I want to try to get a line. Now it looks like my line has a little bit of a curve in it. So I'm going to start at the waist suppression, and I'm going to go back to my black marker, and I'm starting at the waist suppression right here at the waistline, and I'm going to start up, and then it looks like the top of my bodice has a slight curve in it. This happens sometimes when you're draping, and that's quite all right if there's a little bit of a curve on the front bodice here. And this line doesn't have to be perfectly straight. The fuller the bust is, the more apt this is going to happen. So that's okay if you find that this line from the waist to the underarm isn't perfectly straight. Now down here, I'm going to finish connecting my dots and put in the rest of my waist suppression, the part that's below the waist. And then I'm going to switch it over and I'm going to put in my hip. Keeping in mind that I have a new line right here where my adjusted lower hip line was. So I had two red marks here, so I didn't follow these, I followed my new red marks. So now I have my side seam in, my armhole, my side seam, shoulder, and neck in. So basically, now all we have to do now is do our dart, our vertical dart. So what I'm going to do first, I'm going to go ahead and release these pins because this has served its purpose. Actually, hang on a minute before we release the pin. We're going to do something here. We're going to cut this out and then we'll put this dart in because it makes it a lot easier. So I'm going to cut on my new line. Now cut accurately, don't cut in a haste, and just cut generally. You want to cut as accurately as you possibly can. So I'm going to go ahead and finish cutting out the shoulder, the armhole, and the side seam, and then we'll come back and revisit this vertical dart. So now you can see where I've cut this out. I have the perfect dart contour for my new dart so that it's parallel and complements the side seam. So everything's been cut out, and now we're going to reflect or work on this dart. First thing I want to do is measure from this dart point over to center front, and it's 3 3/8. And then I want to measure down here, and it's 3 3/4. Why that is so important is we want the dart fold line of this dart to be parallel to the center front, or at least wider at the hip than it is at the top. So you always want to check your dart point at the top and bottom, making sure the dart point at the top is equal to or narrower than the dart point at the bottom from your center front line. Reason being, usually the hips are slightly wider than the bust area, and we want this dart to complement the body. The end of this dart should actually be somewhere just inside the hip bone area and not too close to the front, because then all it does is cause a pooch over the belly area or the abdomen. So this dart needs to be directed slightly out and just inside the hip bone. Now sometimes this may be even farther from center front if the hip is even wider. So it depends on who you're draping it on and what form you're using. But this looks pretty good for the form I'm using. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and draw in my fold line. Fold line first. So I'm going to go and draw from dart point to dart point my fold line. Now right here in the middle where the waist suppression is, I want to check how deep it is because that's the deepest part of my dart. So I am 1 3/8 right here in this middle part. So I'm just going to center 1 1/2 on there, and that's going to be where my dart, I want let's see, 1 1/2. I want the center line to be 3/4, which is right there. So my dart's pretty centered. I want the same amount, in other words, on each side of my dart. And it looks like that's what I've got, so good to go. If your dart isn't centered on this line, you want to make sure the suppression is equally divided with the fold line. So mine looks pretty good. So then you're just going to connect the points. And that's pretty much it for this dart. And you want to keep it very straight. Remember, this is a sloper. This is a torso sloper. You're not looking at a lot of detail. So now we have our two darts, side dart, vertical dart. We've got our waist mark. Note that my HVL line has a curve. That's because the hip arc, you're round, and a round line on a round surface is usually what you need to have this parallel. You may have more or less of this depending on your form, but that's okay if you notice your lines are a little bit rounded. It's okay because the form is rounded. This is the front. Just going to mark front, torso, and you can put more information on it, but later on we can do that. Now let's look at the back. Let me pull the back over here. So now the back is basically the same type of thing. We want to clean up the edges first. So we're going to go back in, starting at the neckline. I'm going to get a square center back neck. That's very important right here. And then my shoulder, I'm going to use my two red lines because we adjusted it on the form with the red mark. Then I'm going to take my very curve and I'm going to clean up my neck. And I'm just going to go around through this entire back torso block, or sloper, and clean it up. So I'm going to go in here, do the back armhole. Sometimes it takes more than one pass with the very curve or French curve when you're doing these curves. So don't get frustrated if you have to move it around a couple of times to get the actual armhole. And then the upper part of my back, let's see how straight it is. There's actually a subtle curve in there, and I want to kind of honor that. You may have a straight line, you may have a curve, but mine has just a nuance of a curve there. And I'm just going to honor it. So I'm going to draw it in just like this. And then I'm going to take my waist suppression, draw in my waist suppression, and then do the rest of my hip. And you just want to kind of connect as many dots as you can. If you find an unusual one that's kind of out of line, don't go for it. Straighten it back out. So from the lower part of my hip down, I want it straight. I want it parallel to the center back. Now let's work on our dart. So I'm going to take the dart and I'm going to check the measurement of each dart point, and see how far I am from center back. So here, I'm 4 1/4. And down here, I'm 4 1/2. So that's pretty good. I could possibly move this one out. I think I will move it out about 1/4 inch. So I'm 4 1/4 and 4 3/4. Just because of the hip width. I'd like my darts to tilt out just ever such a slight bit. Now at the waist suppression, I'm going to measure this. And I'm 2 inches here. So I want to split 2 inches on my line, and I do have to adjust this one. I had to move the points over a little bit. And then you just connect the dots. It's just that simple. And this is our back. So now we have our muslin drape of our torso cut out on our refined lines. And it's time to true and blend our drape. So the first thing we want to do is true and blend the shoulders. True means making sure that each side of the seam is the same length. And blending is making sure you have a smooth transition at the joint of the seam. So here will be our seam, and I've placed high point shoulder together, and you can see we have a nice smooth transition in the neckline, no divots, no points. And down here, the back shoulder is slightly longer than the front shoulder by a good 1/8 inch. So I've made a note here to fill in this front shoulder 1/8 inch. Now I could do this where I shave this off, but I'd rather have a little more, and when I do my final muslin check, I can always shave both of them off at the same time. If the line is a smooth transition either way, I usually like to err on the full side and not narrow and cut it off. So that's the shoulder, looking really good. Small adjustment right here. Now let's look at the side seams. What I've done is I've taped, or I've pinned the dart back in, the adjusted dart. And I want to look at the armhole. So if I put the armhole base right here, you can see again, it's a nice smooth transition here. Nice and round. It's got enough room for the arm, and I like what it looks like. The next thing is we're going to true the seam by walking out these two edges together. So I'm going to walk them, hold them in place, and when the seam veers away from the underseam or the other side, I just pivot the muslin until it aligns again. And I keep doing this until I get to the bottom. Now, the bottom's off a little bit, so I need to trim it so that they're the same length. When you're draping, you don't pay much attention to this, but when you make your pattern, you'd like to have these two end so that they're the same length. So I'll make a mark right here, and I'll make note that I need to trim the front side off a little bit to fit the back side. So that's it. The next step is we're going to transfer all this to paper and have our paper pattern, and then cut our final muslin and sew it for fit. Now we have our pattern complete, and I have pinned it to the muslin, taking in consideration the selvage so that it runs parallel to the lengthwise grain, parallel to the selvage. I've pinned the pattern down. Now remember, we have no seam allowance on this pattern. So what we're going to do is add 1/2 inch at the shoulders and 0 at the neck. So I'm going to cut right along the neckline here, but I'm going to add 1/2 inch in the armhole. Note how I'm using my see-through ruler to do this. Makes it a lot quicker. You just do a little dash line by booking it to the pattern and then just marking it on the other side of the line at 1/2 inch. So I'm going to mark the, I'm going to make a seam allowance on the armhole because I plan to put a sleeve in during this process, and I want to make sure I have something to sew it to. So I'm just marking all the way around. I'm going to do both of these patterns this way and then cut them out and sew them up. Once we have them sewn up, we're going to go back to the form and just do a final fitting to make sure that everything fits exactly like it should. One thing I have noticed, I did not mark my side waist on the back, so I'll do that as well because I want to carry out my waist notch so that I know I've aligned my side seam too. In the front, I've added a 1 inch fold back because I'm going to press this back just like the original muslin, so I have something solid to pin to the form when I'm finished. So I'm going to do the same to the front, but all I'm doing is adding 0 at the neck, 1/2 inch at the shoulder, 1/2 inch in the armhole, and 1/2 inch on the side seam, none at the bottom, and a 1 inch fold back in the front. So let me finish marking the front, and I will cut them out, sew up a muslin, and we'll take a look and see what we've done. Now we have the muslin sewn up, and this is the front view of the muslin. Let's see if I can bring it up a little bit. I'm liking the way it fits pretty well. I've got a little ease in the armhole, which is anticipated for the sleeve, and the dart looks like it's well placed, both darts. Remember, this is not a fitted garment. It's a basic sloper block so that we can go forward with other things. The neckline is laying nicely. I'm glad I scooped it out a little bit. Now let's look at the side seam. The side seam seems to be very balanced. It's lining up with the side seam on the form, and it's hanging vertical, which is nice. It's not swinging forward or back. The armhole opening looks like it's nice and open and not going to be choking up on the arm when we put the sleeve in. We'll know more about the armhole when we finish the sleeve. Let's take a look at the back. The back too is looking pretty good. It's got no drag lines, no stress. So it's looking very good. The only thing I'm seeing about this entire drape is it looks a little bit full in the lower hip. So I'm going to pin it and then show you what it looks like, and then we'll transfer that information to our pattern, and we'll have a beautiful pattern awaiting a sleeve. So I've pinned out 1/8 on the double through the hip to 0 at the high hip. I think this is going to look a lot better. I can even sew it off of this muslin and check it again, and I'll transfer this information to my torso sloper, and I think I've got a very nice sloper to work with. Sleeves will be made next to fit it. And then once it's fitted and the sleeve looks good, everything will be transferred to tag paper so that I can keep it for a long period of time. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.